as you can see, it's very difficult. Science becomes more and more difficult, which is a characteristic of it. And it means that we need to pay attention to consciousness in a very peculiar way. Now, in the past, when man was an adolescent, that includes up to 1997, adolescent man did not make a distinction between mind and consciousness, and this is a serious flaw. It's an error that amounts to ignorance on scale of stupidity. So let's set ourselves to this distinction. Mind has to do with symbols, and consciousness has to do with science. Mind is a part of nature. Mind is included in the way that the natural cycle has its ecology, so that when the mind becomes purely mind, one has the apex, I'm almost tempted to use the term apotheosis of nature. The mind which is centered is the center of the target of nature. The centered mind is the bullseye of the natural target. That mind, that center, is always integral. It always has an integral nature. It has an integral part of the integral cycle. Its functioning is to integrate so that the mind can be characterized as an integrating, centralizing culmination of nature. Totally distinct from that is consciousness. Consciousness works by a differential mode, not an integral mode. Consciousness extends resonantly, and sometimes even harmonically, beyond the brain. The mind is within the brain. The mind has its functioning on a ritual basis, a ritual physiological existence of the brain. So that you can actually test now various areas of the brain, and you can find corresponding functions of the mind. If you speak a language, there are language centers to the brain. There's even a right side of the brain and a left side of the brain that do different functions. But all those functions, all those capacities are within a set, like a mathematical set, whose mode of operation is integration. One of the qualities of the mind which is centered is that it can transform. The normal mind, the everyday mind, does not transform. Only the centered mind, when it is centered, has the ability to transform, and its transformation allows for the resonances of the mind to generate what we would call consciousness. Now, in consciousness, it has its own cycle. It has its own four-part cycle, just like nature, so that nature and consciousness are related to each other, but they're quite distinct. Nature always favors an integral method, an integral motion. You could even call it a clockwise motion, where things come together. consciousness always favors a differential, which is a different movement. Consciousness likes to open up. It likes to explore and go out. Nature does not like to do that. Nature likes to come together. And as we will see, this is very fortuitous that they have this kind of a capacity. Now, because there are these two distinct capacities, it means that they can be brought together in a juxtaposition that gives a structure to reality which is beneficial. It's like in the cells of an organic species like ourselves. Each cell has a cell wall which allows for cells to have form. Without the cell wall, they wouldn't have a form. A cell wall cannot exist if there were not a complementarity of processes which are able to be annealed, that is, brought together, in such a way that both functions are married. The two functions that are married in the wall of a cell are water-loving and water-hating. Hydrophobic, hydrophilic. One side of the cell loves water and welcomes it. The other side doesn't like water and doesn't welcome it. So that the wall of the cell would be a brick wall, not allowing anything to pass in between them, were it not for certain gates that are embedded in the wall of the cell. And the embedding is a part of the structure of how the cell wall forms in the first place. Those embedded thresholds, those embedded gates in cell walls, are usually ionized atoms of calcium or potassium or sometimes sodium. And those calcium channels, those sodium channels, allow for life processes to permeate, to go in between the two polarities in function of the cell wall. Now we'll see this is a universal structure. It holds also, not only in organic matter, but it holds in inorganic matter to an extraordinarily accurate degree. For instance, one of the things which Richard Feynman was most famous for is the way in which he characterized the relationship between subatomic and atomic particles. Here in this little volume, Most of the Good Stuff, Memoirs of Richard Feynman, published by the American Institute of Physicists. Here in this little chapter called Feynman and Partons. Feynman coined the term partons. They're little parts of what we previously thought was something extremely stable and there. This man, writing the article, worked at the time for the Stanford Linear Accelerator in Stanford, California, Stanford University. He writes, by the late 1960s, when the Stanford Linear Accelerator program was initiated, Feynman was working on descriptions of high-energy hadron-hadron collisions. What is a hadron? We have to go here to Feynman's classic little book, Photon-Hadron Interactions. And on the very first page, we find the very first sentence, one very powerful way of experimentally investigating the strongly interacting particles, parentheses, hadrons, strongly interacting particles, particles that interact very strongly, called hadrons, is to look at them and to probe them with a known particle, in particular the photon, because no other is so well known. Feynman addressed an issue in this particular book, which was very disturbing at the time. And the issue is that in consciousness, and science as the culmination of consciousness, science is always a differentially operating objectivity. In order for science to have an integrating quality, an integrating function, it has to refer back to the mind. It has to refer back to symbols, and that's why a scientist will use mathematics. Mathematics is a symbolic language of the mind. But that symbolic language of the mind must not be confused with, is to be kept distinct from, the conscious science that's actually occurring. If you do not, you're not able to be aware when you are experiencing within the mind in a language structure which is purely mental, and you suppose that to be a part of nature, which it is, but it's a culminating abstract part of nature, and you confuse that entire ensemble with science, with the actual cosmos. And not only does that confusion take place, but one confuses that with oneself. Because we've seen that the person is a differential form, and now we're understanding that the cosmos is also a differential form. That is to say, they belong to an opening out objectivity. The person, rather than being a target, like a form in nature, is more like a prism. Works with a spectrum of possibilities, is real in regard to a spectrum of possibilities, not in terms of a target of perimeters. So that someone who's using a kind of a language which involves a psychological characterization of people in terms of the perimeters of their behavior is actually a con man giving you a phony bill of goods. There's a very distinctive language which not only takes place millions of times a day, but is held in great regard as if it's the language of experts, and all of it is extraneous and irrelevant to what is real. It has no bearing whatsoever. And in the future, our matured descendants will simply be able to spot this, and just upon hearing that kind of language, will be able to set it aside as some kind of egotistic dramatization. It has nothing at all to do with anything real. It has to do with mythic scenarios of somebody's mind. Let's come back to the beginning. We've taken an excursion, we've taken a big swath, we've opened up a lot of issues, we've opened up a lot of questions. What's the beginning here? Let's come back to the beginning. The beginning is we're trying to understand that the mind is distinct from consciousness. That the mind has something to do with a culmination of the integrating capacity of nature. It's difficult to see because the mind prides itself, in particular, when it gets well muscled. Its muscles come from its ability to abstract itself from nature, and so it tends to consider itself as different from nature. And this is actually an egotistical, almost unavoidable egotistical bias. It's true that the mind becomes more and more abstracted from nature, but that abstraction is a part of the integration function of the mind. And it simply withdraws from its larger participation in nature, its larger participation in existence, even its larger participation in experience, and tends more and more to continue integrating, and that integration process withdraws itself into itself. But nevertheless, the mind and all of its functions are part of nature of the natural ecology. This is still integration. The only way that symbols work is that they compact meaning, they compact images and ideas, and they continue the integrating function. Now there is a definite, distinct difference between that and the way in which consciousness fans out. For instance, common language, if you are envisioning possibilities, you go outside of your mind. Almost any of you have the capacity to have vision. Several thousand years ago, it was a capacity limited to very few men and women, very special men and women. But because of evolution and because of development, almost all of us today have more or less the capacity, at least for rudimentary visioning. In the farther extensions of the Renaissance, in the Elizabethan English extensions of the Italian Renaissance, they used to have a third eye in the forehead of the alchemist, and out of that came rays of envisionment. This is one of the favorite illustrations of a British, of an English alchemist named Flood, Robert Flood. That the inner eye sees out, and these rays of vision seeing out are the differentiating consciousness. They're the vibration, they're the carrier waves, they're the resonant wavelets of consciousness visioning. One has to go outside of one's mind to do this. Now, in terms of the standard Greco-Roman history of ideas, that visioning, that alchemical, in this case, visioning, was termed irrational. Because rationality was limited to the mind. The mind is rational. The Greeks prided themselves on the discovery and enumeration and delineation of the rational mind. And when you go out from the mind, you go into an irrational state of affairs. The language, colloquial phrases that still take place in our own time, thousands of years later, carry the prejudices and the predilections for that kind of taste. One says, if you're really scared, I was scared out of my mind. I was scared out of my wits. Or one falls in love to the extent that one falls head over heels. These are all phrases meant to convey that one is going outside of one's mind. Not only of one's mind, but of the target, the compact form of targeting integral nature. One is going into some other realm. An irrational realm, they thought. Notice that one can go into, quote, irrational realms by fear or by ecstasy. By love raised to the pitch of passion, ecstasy, and fear both took oneself outside of the mind. So that the Greek mythological images of fear and of passion were Ares and Aphrodite, Mars and Venus. So one would find in the Renaissance very much interest in, say, like an artist like Botticelli, one of whose greatest paintings is Mars and Venus at rest together. Venus looking very satisfied, having enjoyed a tryst with Mars, and there's Mars snoozing contentedly. It's not that terror and ecstasy finally met and canceled each other out. It's that terror and ecstasy met and formed a third resolving quality. That fear and passion together, when they are annealed and brought together, don't cancel each other out, but they have a quality that's called exchange. They exchange what? They exchange centers of structure. And in the exchange of centers of structure, a resolving third occurs. The resolving third in terms of Greek mythological imagery is Athena. Athena is not prey to fear or to ecstasy, but she embodies wisdom. Because one can go out of the mind not only in terms of fear, and not only be out of your mind in terms of ecstasy, ecstasis, standing apart. From what? From your mind, from your physical body. But there's a third way, and that is transcendental wisdom. Because wisdom is able to transcend. It's able also to leave the mind. But transcendental wisdom has not some kind of simple structure like fear or ecstasy, but transcendental wisdom always has a ratio of those two together. So that in some very highfalutin circles in the 20th century, there are people who now talk about what is rational is transcendental wisdom and not at all the mind. The natural mind is not rational at all. It's logical, but not rational. It follows a sequential ordering which is founded upon myth. For instance, the Aristotelian syllogism in logic, that one has a subject, one has a predicate, and then one has some kind of a conclusion. Socrates is a man. All men are mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That logical form belongs to the mind. But to confuse that logical form with rationality is very great error. It's a structural conceit. It's a psychological faux pas of enormous dimensions, and it's caused a lot of sickness in civilization. So a doctor of civilization like myself comes along with the stethoscope and the little black bag, says the patient's sick. Is he suffering from? Suffering from logic-itis. Suffering from delusions of rationalism. You think that you're rational, and God hopes that you are rational, but going about it this way is not going to do it. This whole complication is very difficult to understand because the very tool that one is using to understand it is the mind, and the mind by itself cannot comprehend this. So it's fortuitous for ourselves that consciousness is quite distinct from the mind. But it also turns out, on very deep, profound levels of education, that consciousness by itself is not capable of understanding it either. It's very peculiar. It's like reality, to be understandable, requires wholeness, just like they used to tell us. You have to be whole to be real, except that they didn't understand when they were using those terms to what depth and extent and profundity those terms actually are when one says this. Now, the differential consciousness and the integral mind, when they are brought together, they're not brought together in some clumsy polarity where they stand off staring at each other. When they're brought together, they tend to have an exchange of centers between them. Just like Mars and Venus in Renaissance painting, in our example, Botticelli. You can go and find in almost any Renaissance art book, there's Botticelli's portrait of Mars and Venus, Ares and Aphrodite. Fear, terror, and love ecstasy brought together modulate in a ratio between the two of them, and that ratio becomes a resolving third objectivity, which is wisdom, transcendental wisdom. So that transcendental wisdom is never a simple, singular objectivity, but always has some kind of a ratio. It always has a proportionate structure. So that music, for instance, that works with fundamental proportions, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, those musical ratios are consciousness, and music is a conscious language. Whereas mathematics is very much a language of the integral mind, music is very much a language of conscious differentiation. Music is the language of person. Minds can communicate by symbols, but people only communicate by symbols and are satisfied that when their ideologues who have regressed back to some ideological basis, which is a mental level of operating. When conscious, differentiated persons speak together, they're likely to sing together. They sing a duet. And it turns out that singing people have a very realistic relationship to the cosmos, because it turns out that the stars also sing together. The old phrase, which Pythagoras gave to it, is the music of the spheres. Heaven has a structure, and the structure is not that it's dumb and silent and just there, it's like some static thing that you could pound on, but that the heavens are a series of ratios of harmonies which are a music. And indeed, every single star system in the cosmos has its own harmonic. Our star, named Sol, and hence all of the planets and moons and satellites and comets and gas clouds and everything that goes together with this star system, the solar system, has a governing harmonic. Each planet has a particular note within that harmonic. Our own planet, this here ball of earth, if I could only pound it, this planet has a particular singular sound that it makes in orbit around the star. In fact, about 10 years ago, JPL, just over here in a suburb of Pasadena, Los Angeles, made little whistles for an Earth Day, and the whistles were tuned to the sound that the planet makes in its orbit around our star. And you could blow on that little whistle, and it made a high-pitched sound that for all the world sounded like the high-pitched, shrill, mystical phantom whisper that you might have heard on the North American plains 1,000 years ago. It makes the same sound, or we should say in this case, a similar sound, a sound harmonically modulable to the sound of an eagle bone whistle. The kind of eagle bone whistle that was used in the Sundance. The Algonquin word for the ceremony was the okan. And at midsummer, on the high plains of North America, when man had to display to Mother Nature that he was worthy of being alive, he was worthy of her love for him, that he was worthy to be given food and life and opportunity, and that he would share his life reality in love with her, that man and nature had a love affair, was confirmed by his establishing at the summer solstice Sundance his courage. And his courage was to, in this culture, was to have bone antler points made into skewers that were placed in his flesh around the shoulder, and long rawhide thongs were tied to the ends of those skewers, and on the other end were tied to the top of the Sundance pole. And he had to dance around that Sundance pole and pull himself free from that, and it would make severe lacerations in his flesh, which would then heal over and there would be scars. And they were rather like German dueling scars, only these were scars of dueling with the courage of reality on very Paleolithic, gutsy level. If he cried out with a human voice, it meant that he was defeated and the tribe was not worthy of being given life and love by Mother Nature. But so powerful was the natural urge to cry out, to shout from pain, from fear, that he was allowed a transcendental form of shouting. He was allowed to have an eagle bone whistle in his mouth, and he could blow on this eagle bone whistle, and that plaintive cry was not some kind of reactive natural response, but was an expressive conscious sound. Someone who would regress would, in his panic, lose control of the whistle and it would fall out of his mouth or blow out of his mouth. You would have to have a lot of wits about you, a lot of consciousness, to keep the whistle in your mouth under that pain and its ability to be blown. And I remember hearing that sound. I remember hearing that sound, and when I heard the NASA whistle about the sound of the planet in orbit around the sun, it was a similar sound. As a friend of mine says, I got real quiet. That somehow Paleolithic human beings on the high plains of North America had understood a universal Pythagorean truth without ever having heard of Pythagoras or even mathematics, or especially not JPL. And yet it was there. Alignments which are too exact to be untrue. Alignments which are so fantastically impossible unless there were some kind of diagonal that runs itself across the diameters of both circles, the circle of nature and the circle of consciousness, allowing for a single diagonal to transverse that infinity sign of the two circles brought together. In a mystical painting like Marc Chagall's early painting, the painting called I and the Village, where he has the animals floating in the sky, and he has all of the farm buildings floating in the sky, and in this phantasmagoria where gravity no longer operates in its natural form, but in its Hasidic form of conscious vision. The man and the woman, the farmer and his lady. He is upside down and she is right side up. And he is carrying a hoe and she is carrying a stick that's used in laundry, hitting. When you used to hang laundry up, you used to hit it to get it to be clean and dry. It's the same stick. It's the same line. It's Chagall's Hasidic way of saying reality, when the mind and consciousness meet, there's an exchange that's a single diagonal. And that's how, in this case, a man and a woman in a Hasidic life are real together and form some kind of a baton of truth, which is discernible in the art and in the life, in the conscious art and in the farm life, in the consciousness of cosmic resonances, and in the integral that belongs right there on the old farm on the good earth. Let's come back to the beginning again, and we're going to take a break in just a moment. Let's come back to most of the good stuff, Memoirs of Richard Feynman. Man's writing on Feynman and partons. In the late 1960s, when the Stanford Linear Accelerator program was initiated, Feynman was working on descriptions of high-energy hadron-hadron collisions, strongly reacting particles. And because if you bring two hadrons together, in the early days they were completely unknown. You don't know what particles they are. Who knows? They're strongly interreacting, but who knows what particles? Whereas if you have one particle that you know about interreacting with a hadron, you can use that known particle as one side of your balance, and you can investigate the unknown particle. Hence, photon-hadron interactions, because the photon as a particle of light was the most known. So early physics, nuclear physics, used light particles to investigate the unknown particles of the atomic structure. They used light surgery on the atoms in order to find out what else is there. And Feynman was one of the great theorists who showed that the photon-hadron interactions had a very particular kind of a quality, and he couldn't quite get it expressed until he got to the partons, and then he found that there was a very archetypal situation happening. Here's how it reads. Feynman was working on descriptions of high-energy hadron-hadron collisions and later photon-hadron collisions. He pictured the typical reaction as occurring by the exchange of constituents. The secret exchange of selves. You see reciprocal qualities, which we saw in the ritual section of the course, which are a fundamental structure of existential cooperation. If there's no exchange, there's no business. The whole business of existence is based upon exchange. It turns out on the subnuclear level that this is also true. Feynman pictured the typical reaction as occurring by an exchange of constituents. These constituents, Feynman called them partons. You know, electrons, photons, they're parts of something, so they're partons. Between the rapidly moving projectiles, the primary basis for his parton picture was empirical. Significant evidence was the apparently exponentially bounded transverse momentum distribution of produced or scattered secondary particles. Now, this is highfalutin talk, nuclear physics, but if you're following what I'm saying, at least you get the insight that there's an alignment in the language which one can use for nuclear physics with the language that one can use for the Algonquin Indian sun dance, with the language one can use for Renaissance painting or for 20th century painting, and that somehow all of these alignments mean something. They mean that the mind and consciousness can be so aligned that a single diagonal can be drawn. And that single diagonal is an alignment. But that the alignment is only straight when it occurs in a mythic level of experience. When you put time and space together, straight lines curve. They're still straight lines, but because one now has time, space, straight lines always curve. Paul Klee, in his theory of art, said art inhabits a universe so vast that straight lines can be seen to fall. He said this about the same time that Heisenberg and Schrödinger and Bohr and Einstein were working on nuclear physics. But when one is working with conscious space-time, not a four-dimensional, not a three-dimensional, but a five-dimensional continuum, straight lines not only curve, but they curlicue. I become like Suzy Q potatoes. Is that basic enough for you? When one looks at a hydrogen bubble chamber in nuclear physics, one sees characteristically the kinds of curlicues that belong to conscious space-time. They're characteristic. Which means that these interactions that are taking place in that hydrogen bubble chamber are taking place not within space-time, a four-dimensional continuum, but within conscious space-time, a five-dimensional continuum. Why? They curlicule in the hydrogen cloud chamber because the hydrogen cloud chamber is already a conscious adjunct to the time-space in which that event happens. It's very difficult to appreciate that fineness, but it's necessary to appreciate that fineness because when we come back to the break, we have bad news and good news. We'll come back to a very difficult observation, one which is borne out over the last 200 years especially, are the problems that society has with science. The more that science develops, the less control minds have over it, which seems like an impossibility. It seems like a non sequitur. How can that be? And it's only appreciable, much less understandable, in terms of making a distinction between mind and consciousness. Now, someone in nature will not know that consciousness is different in function from the mind. Most human beings on this particular planet, 99.99 up to a trace element, have never developed enough to be able to appreciate that possibility even. But the very structure of integration, the very characterization of the natural cycle, makes it impossible. It's not possible to imagine, it's not possible to expect, it's impossible to accept on the level of experience, on the level of physicality, existence, the mythic horizon of language and of culture and of tribal security. All of that is challenged enough by the mind. The mind is already much more than they bargained for. And yet, on the scale of problems, the mind is not really a problem at all yet. The problems begin with consciousness. As science develops, as that level of the development of the cycle of consciousness from vision through art, through history to science, as science develops, as it begins to have its amplitude, as the space of science occurs. Let's pause for just a minute. What's the problem here with our machinery? What is it? Is there a problem here with the equipment? The mic should be what? Pardon? The mic is in the frame. Is that fine? Let's try and concentrate because this is very hard to follow. It's hard to follow for somebody who is a super yogi. Somebody who has a power to concentrate and hold that concentration for years on end. It is almost on the edge of consciousness, even with that capacity. And yet the oddness of history is that now hundreds of millions of men and women in the next 10 years have to learn to be able to address this kind of problem conscientiously and come to deal with it. We cannot drift. And yet, the very intensity of focus is the bad news. The requirement that consciousness be focused and disciplined to this extent is the bad news. Because everything about our nature, our body, our culture, our language in its natural form, even to a great extent our mind, when it's brought into play in terms of scientific vistas, that infinity of possibilities is so daunting that consciousness seeks to retain almost desperately the anchor of some kind of integral objectivity. That is to say, Consciousness becomes afraid of the infinities in the cosmos and cringes from that, and in cringing from that holds on to the last objectivity that was there in integration, which is the mind. So that the mind experiences a crisis. The mind experiences any further excursions into infinity as a form of madness. So that science has built in to its structure a madness, an insanity, an irrationality that's not just the kind of provincial colloquial irrationality that Greek philosophers had way back when in Athens, or Greek schools of thought. Their irrationality is very small compared to the terror of the infinite that we experience in our time. Manyfold. We deal with the fears that people of 2,000, 3,000 years ago, we deal with them almost momentarily in our lives. They could never have imagined the scale of terror which we face actually. They also could not imagine the scale of ecstasy which is available to us. Not speaking pharmacologically, I'm speaking scientifically. I'm speaking in terms of the wonders of the actual cosmos. It's only been 400 years since Galileo was the first human being who saw the little moons moving around Jupiter. When he declared such a simple little thing that he saw with his eyes through his telescope, that there were little moons that circled Jupiter, he was jailed for the rest of his life as a heretic. Because theological dogma said that the planets form circles and these circular orbits are God-made, and this is the way the universe is real. You cannot have circles that are not there already. You can't have circles around the items that are encircling. You introduce sub-cycles, which are irrational. This is theologically not permitted. You didn't see it. They do not move. And so Galileo, being a sensible Italian, said, I'll sign anything you give me. That's fine. But here's my telescope. What do you see? His famous statement in translation, the church is completely right and yet they move. Because you can look any night through the telescope and you can see them. The moons do not circle the sun, they circle Jupiter. We know today, 400 years later, that there are whole clouds of galactic structures, billions of years in the arcs around bubbles of void that are so large that it beggars the imagination. There's no way to even imagine it. And yet, you can see photographs of such phenomenon. You can even take yourself here in Los Angeles, occasionally the Griffith Park Observatory will have the telescope available, or you can go up to Mount Wilson now that some of the telescopes are operative again. And if you get an opportunity and you look at stellar phenomenon with your own eye, with your personal, quote, naked eye through a telescope, there's an eerie, lovable veracity to celestial objects. They're not there abstractly. like an image in the mind. They're there vibrantly, as if they were a resonance of you. There's something personal about the cosmos when you look at it. It's like standing between the darkened earth with no lights and a brilliant starry sky. There's something magical about the whole quality because it includes you. Though that starry canopy has something deeply intrinsically to do with you. It's real, like you're real, and that your realities not only are together, like in touching, but they're there synergistically as in exchanging. You feel the stars not only calling to you, but entering you, and something of yourself entering those stars. One of the great science fiction potboilers from the early part of the 20th century is Edgar Rice Burroughs' Warlord of Mars, about John Carter, this Civil War soldier who thinks that he's been killed in combat and crawls into a cave, and he comes to the edge of the cave, and he sees Mars glowing in the sky, and he feels this eerie call from Mars, and before he knows it, he has physically gone there to Mars. That his Earth self has exchanged with a Martian self, which is now John Carter. It's this kind of magic in Edgar Rice Burroughs that has sold 500 million copies of his books, which has sold quadrillions of books and movies because everyone feels this. From the North Saharan Dogon who look at the star Sirius, and they live lives that are in the Sirius star system, not in the Saharan desert. They have Syrian star beings who come and live lives here. It's a universal phenomenon that the cosmos exchanges selves with us. Our secret self is not limited to the dimensions of the mind. That it's an egotistical reduction to say that the soul is the center of the mind. That's not true at all. That the spirit is some kind of evanescent quality of the mind. That's not true at all. The mind, like a kind of implosion, takes its structure, its integral sense of reality, and carries it to an nth degree, which functions almost as if it turned inside out. Almost as if then consciousness is the other side of the mind. And that cosmos, the cosmos that we see, is the other side of nature. In Marie-Louise von Franz's introduction to the third volume of Carl Jung's great magnum opus, his Mysterium Conjunctionis. In the German, it was in 3 volumes. In the English translation, they were so afraid, so leery of publishing the third volume that they decided to publish it outside the collected works of Jung. We're not going to admit it into the canon of works. And since the collected works has black covers, this book will be published. It'll have red covers. And it won't even be by Jung. It'll have to be by his co-worker, Marie-Louise von Franz. It's about an alchemical death dream that Thomas Aquinas had, which completely turns inside out the entire theological structure of Christianity. Marie-Louise von Franz quotes in the introduction. She's talking about the kind of universe that Einstein and Minkowski envisioned and said, Jung definitely, towards the apogee of his creative life in the early 50s, when he was writing Mysterium Coniunctionis. Mysterium Coniunctionis is about the alchemical exchange of cells. It's about reconciliation, not about polarities meeting, but about complementarities melding together and being something other than either of them were. Something new, different, distinct, something differentiable. In her introduction, Marie-Louise von Franz says Jung was convinced that if you went with a powerful, concerted therapy, with a therapeutic journey within the human mind, and you went deep into the mind, deep into the subconscious, deep into the unconscious, that at the farthest reaches of the deepest unconscious in the human mind, you would come out at the edge of the known universe. That if you went as deep into yourself as you could go, you would come out at the farthest reaches of the observable astrophysical universe. That we form some kind of great interpenetrating figure 8, infinity sign of truth and reality, and that has an alignment which is unmistakable. And the alignment is not straight lines that are drawn by the ego, nor even curving lines that are drawn by sophisticated persons, but these kind of very peculiar curlicules of events that keep occurring and keep relating and keep curliculing, so that one begins to notice that though these people and these situations, these events, these kinds of qualities are not geometrically straight alignment, nor are they curved in some parabolic or hypersonic qualities, but nevertheless there's some kind of nuclear, fractal, curlicule, scramble that feels like it belongs together, that acts as if it belongs together. These are those advanced spiritual transcendental lines of orientation that are true. They are true on the deepest, farthest levels that one can go. And one can get used to going those ways. One can become a backpacker on the high Dharma mountain trails, where you can begin to look for the next step because you have a feel for the way that the curliculing is going, and move that way, and sure enough, there's the person, there's the event, that whatever that person is, there and then and who, they're exactly right. And one of the peculiar qualities is that they always recognize you. That you are for them exactly right. How can that be? But the question is not how can that be, but how does that happen, because it goes on in infinite occurrence. It's always that way. The miracle, the surprise, is in high consciousness that it's never not that way. It is always that way for everyone. And that it's just veils of ignorance that do not allow that to be seen, to be known, to be recognized. So that the stepping off into some ego-based straight line turns out initially to be tangent to truth, and as one goes further and further along that way, it just simply isn't true at all. And finally, It's a complete fantasy. Ideologies are always that way. In 1905, it seemed that a kind of Marxism should be just right for a Russian revolution. And by 1917, it was so convincing that they were killing people by the millions for it. And now, some 80 years later, it's apparent that that is a complete fantasy. It never was true to the extent that it never could have been true. In all the possibilities of infinity, it never would have been true. And one says, how can 250 million people for 4 or 5 generations be deceived to that extent? And the answer is, it's not just that 250 million people are deceived for 3 or 4 generations, but that the entire species for millennia has been deceived, has been self-deceived on a scale that life has never run true for larger forms than just a few people together. That there have never been larger forms than just handfuls of men and women for 1 or 2 generations that have ever lived truthful curlicues. That it simply has not happened. And thank goodness Mother Nature doesn't have to hold her breath for her children to be real. She would have asphyxiated long ago. But she, in loving patience, encourages and expects that she will have children who will be real. Real not only to her, but unto themselves and to each other. And her expectation is that it's high time because her earth is rather ill now, being scarred by all these gouged straight lines that are being drawn by billions of people at a time, under the aegis that these are geometries of politics or religion or whatever discipline. And notice here that we come back to the beginning of this second half of the lecture, that the more that consciousness comes into its power, the more that it begins to resemble madness. It has a complement because the deeper that one goes into silence in the mind, the more that that begins to resemble death. And that the fearfulness of going to the silent center of the mind is the fearfulness that's there for a death experience. Not just a death experience, that's a very convenient conscious phrasing. The old way of talking was death. You're going to die. The body senses that this is nearing death. That's why it shies away from that. It won't go, refuses to go. The body refuses to countenance that kind of concentration because it experiences that as death. Why? Because nature is always a seething ocean of change, and the center of concentration is stillness, a still point. And the only still point the body knows is death. When it cannot make a distinction because it's an integral functioning way. It doesn't know about differentiations on that kind of a scale. It never has, never will. And gets surprised that instead of the still point of the mind being a death is a transformation. Always gets surprised by transformation. The most beautiful, picturesque way I know of writing about this was the young D.T. Suzuki, who lived to be about 97 years old and was the great bringer of Zen to the English-speaking world. He was invited about 100 years ago, 1896, to go to Chicago from Japan. and do some translating. And his master, Soyen Shaku Roshi, said, "You cannot go unless you have had your deep satori, your deep awakening moment, your transformation center." And he said to the young Suzuki, who was about 20 years old at the time, he said, "The time has come for you to face the fact that because you've been invited to go, it's a part of your reality, and you must go, and yet you cannot go unless you have had this moment of satori. So if you do not have this moment of satori in 3 days when your steamer sails, then you will have to commit harikari. You'll have to die." And so for 2 days and 11 hours and 50-some minutes, the 20-year-old DT Suzuki, his name Daisetsu means great humility, because he learned. He was absolutely frantic. And slowly he became convinced that he was going to have to kill himself. Because the more that he was successful in going within to the center, the more it was a death. It was death. So he got it. That what his teacher has said to him, there is no difference between what you're going to do and death anyway. There really isn't two choices at all. It's just that occurrence. And so at 11:59 on the third day, he let go. He realized that he was beat. You have to die. About an hour later, he heard some water dripping someplace, and then he heard a bird chirp. And he stood up, and he walked out of the zendo, and he looked outside. It was nighttime, with just some lights, and he was absolutely astounded. And he wrote, in his late 80s, he wrote this memoir. He said, "I looked out, and I was completely astounded because all the trees were transparent. You could see through them." And he looked down at his own body, and he said, I was astounded. I was transparent too. Because differential consciousness is not stopped by integral walls. It looks right through them, because it's not caged by, it's not determined by the exigencies of defining space or even defining time. Consciousness looks through time and space as if it were just transparent veils. And when it becomes really powerful, even the veiled phantom quality is no longer there. One looks to see wherever one would see. In Black Elk Speaks, when Black Elk realizes that he is this huge eagle flying, and from the eye of the eagle, when he looks down, he can see all the animals, and he sees the landscape, and he sees his little village down there, and he learns that the more that he concentrates upon looking, the more detail he can see. Finally, he looks down into the village, he looks into the teepee, and he sees his body there in the bed below. And as the spiritual eagle which he is now, he gives life back to that dead body, and that dead body wakes up, and the 8-year-old black elk realizes that he's had some kind of a vision. Something has happened to him. Then, of course, what happens in cultural, tribal situations, where the mythic horizon is the secure process, one tends to forget that and dismiss that. Oh, it was a dream. Or it didn't really happen that way. I'm misremembering. And it wasn't until he was a grown man that it came again to him. And he realized not only was it true, it was still true, because he had the capacity all of a sudden again. He could see again. He could look through things. It's a stage of development in early yoga where you are able to look through your closed eyelids when you're asleep and see the room where you are. You can just see. You can count the flowers in the vase, and you're sound asleep, your eyes are closed, and you just look. And after a while, you learn that you can look not only at what's in the room in the dark through your closed eyelids, but you can look through time, you can look through space, wherever you wish. And there are little raptures and rapports that come emotionally with those kinds of experiences, those kinds of events. Once they filter down and exchange cells, once the high Dharma art exchanges self on the ritual level, the body then has a sense of calm to it. It's like the spirit has taken some egg of time, space, and put it deep into the structure of the body, and the body then feels itself pregnant with calm, with some center of calm that's come from somewhere else because of exchange. Let's come back to science. Let's come back to the peculiarity that the more that science obtains as pure consciousness, the more it begins to resemble madness. Just like for the integral calming of the mind seemed like death, the differential consciousness approaching infinity of the cosmos seems like madness. One is convinced it's absolute crazy. This is it. Yet that also is a transformation node. One doesn't die. One doesn't go crazy. It isn't madness. It's like madness isn't madness. The transformation node. What do you come out of? Like D.T. Suzuki coming out of the Zendo and seeing the transparency. What do you see on the other side of infinity? You see again nature in all of its mystery. So the good news with an education like this, instead of trying to compute by looking backwards all the time, which is a holdover ritual comportment from integration, one has the opportunity to learn a new forward-looking, forward-going sense. Because as the mind goes out of its square of attention, and the base becomes more and more vision, so that one square of attention is vision, art, history, and science, total consciousness, no integration at all differential. One can, in a transformative way, begin to exchange nature for vision, so that your square of attention is now art, history, science, nature. And you learn that you can fast forward the square of attention for any of those squares. And not only that, but because you now have freedom to have any ratios that you want, you can make a square of attention out of any of the phases. You can have states of reality that were impossible before. They weren't even conceivable. It wasn't even within the realm of feasibility. And now it's a freedom that one has. And not only that, but that the squareness of attention, the framedness of reference, becomes transcended, and one can have completely different relationalities. Instead of having geometries of attention, one can have whole fields of infinities of attentiveness. Then the art of being a spiritual being becomes something that only fairy tales hint at. That all those limitations were but little children's building blocks in sandboxes, and that they were there because you had to learn to play. And that language isn't little cubes of wood with single letters on it, but sometimes is some kind of a poem like Rilke. It has very little to do except that its origins were there in the letter blocks in the sandbox. But the scale in which one can sing now is phenomenal. At this point is the point when language bursts into a cosmic song. In fact, we have a work of art in which it does just that, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And the song that it burst into is Schiller's Ode to Freedom. They used to call it Ode to Joy until they realized that the German word actually means freedom. And one can see this wonderful video of the performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony when the Berlin Wall was torn down. Leonard Bernstein directed the Philharmonic, not in a concert hall, but in the center of the city of Berlin, saying, there is no diagonal line that splits the city between east and west anymore. That was a fiction of a diseased imagination that has nothing to do with the men and women who are real here. Now, when that Ninth Symphony, and you can see it on video, burst into song, the whole population of Berlin began singing because they got it. There never was a wall except in a fictive bad play that kept parading itself in front of us and hypnotically trying to distract us from our reality as men and women, that we actually are interested in each other. We'd like to sing together. That's the kind of world that the 21st century is all about. The third millennium, the next 1,000 years, is all about that kind of singing together. It has nothing to do with the dead-end fictions of the past. But in order to draw defining thresholds for that, you have to not draw them. Because if you're a doctor of civilization, you know that the patient is still sick, and if you drew those defining thresholds, they would see that as a wall of death or madness. And so you teach them to go through those walls and omit telling them that the walls are not there in the first place. You tell them, yes, the walls are there, but you can go through them. That you have an osmotic, magic power to go through those walls of death and madness. Because they will not hold you in serious blame when they discover that there were no walls there in the first place. That death and madness were fictions of a limited quality of apperception. And that, in fact, there's no such thing as death or madness anywhere in the reality of truth. When he was told that his good friend Lazarus had died and was buried, Jesus replied, first, what death? They omitted that from the Gospels because it was rather severe, but they put in the fact that he went to the door of the tomb and said, Lazarus, come out. And he did. There's no such thing as death or madness anywhere in reality. When one looks with the eye of the spiritual eagle, you do not see anywhere some kind of a defining wall that kills you, or some kind of a wall that makes you crazy so that you never could recover and be whole. They do not exist. To belabor a life under the illusion that such things are there and the delusion that they threaten you is just simply bad playing. Even though it makes you sick to death and madness to suffer those fears, it's actually a case of a child frightening itself by telling bad stories. A good education like this is an education that runs us forward long enough so that you get used to the fact that you can keep on trucking. And if you do, you get used to not looking back, but experiencing ambidextrously. That forward and back have little to do, actually, finally, with sequencing. That logic is not about syllogistic placement of things, but about the proportionate ratios of harmonies. It's about music and not about passing tests. More next week.